they actually did, but they're not going forward. Right.
I'm going forward.
Yeah, at this point, we're getting black no matter what. We'll never see it come to the floor. I got it on my camera now, it's on my phone, thank God. On the pink? Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah. It's facing. More beautiful.
See. Oh, I can't go anywhere.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Savannah Guthrie.
Good day, everybody. We are coming on the air with breaking news. The president is about to announce he is withdrawing the U.S. from the nuclear deal with Iran. That, according to sources who say the White House alerted members of Congress this afternoon. This is not a surprise, but it's hugely consequential. The president campaigned against the Iran deal, vowed to rip it up if elected, and it appears he is about to make good on that promise. But world leaders, allies of the U.S., have been lobbying hard to keep him from doing so, saying this deal has helped stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So how far will the president go today? How will Iran react? That is anyone's guess. We await comment from the president. This is uncharted territory. Let's go straight to our chief White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson, with the latest. Hallie, as we say hello to you, what do we expect to hear from the president?
Well, Savannah, you're asking all the key questions, the ones that we will be watching for, as it is our understanding that in about 90 seconds, President Trump will head to that podium. And according to two sources familiar with these discussions, his administration has been telling congressional leaders that he is going to pull the United States out of that Iranian nuclear deal. It's one of the most, from a macro perspective, consequential foreign policy decisions that President Trump has made yet. And it's one that puts him at odds with some key allies overseas. Just in the last couple of weeks, you've seen this parade of foreign leaders coming through the White House, talking with the president from France, from the EU, from the UK, for example, trying to convince Donald Trump to stay in. It appears that those arguments have fallen on deaf ears. For President Trump, this is a promise made, promise kept. He has called the Iran deal the worst deal he's ever seen, a bad deal, a terrible deal, a horrible deal. He doesn't want it. He doesn't want to be in it. But here's the question. If, in fact, he does now put those punishments back on Iran, those sanctions, will there be a window to, for example, disentangle corporations from any kind of business interactions they may have with Iranian companies and so on? So that's the question we're looking for. And this may have an impact, of course, to folks who are watching this, folks at home, because Iran has become an oil powerhouse. So if, in fact, any new sanctions make it harder for Iran to get their oil out on the global markets, you know that could mean gas prices may go up. Experts are predicting they may possibly get above $3 a gallon this summer, Savannah.
And the big question, as I turn to Andrea Mitchell, our chief foreign affairs correspondent, is what Iran does now. Because, of course, the whole underpinning of this agreement was to stop Iran from trying to obtain a nuclear weapon, something Iran has always denied, but the West has never believed. And this deal, Andrea, if you could explain it for everybody, was supposed to put eyes on Iran. We'll lift sanctions on you if you're going to allow our inspectors in. So if the deal is done and the U.S. exits and we rip it up today, what happens with that?
Well, it's expected that the Iranian regime, and here's the president to explain it himself. So let's listen to his explanation for what he's doing today.
My fellow Americans, today I want to update the world on our efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terror. It exports dangerous missiles, fuels conflicts across the Middle East, and supports terrorist proxies and militias such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Over the years, Iran and its proxies have bombed American embassies and military installations, murdered hundreds of American service members, and kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured American citizens. The Iranian regime has funded its long reign of chaos and terror by plundering the wealth of its own people. No action taken by the regime has been more dangerous than its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them. In 2015, the previous administration joined with other nations in a deal regarding Iran's nuclear program. This agreement was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. In theory, the so-called Iran deal was supposed to protect the United States and our allies from the lunacy of an Iranian nuclear bomb, a weapon that will only endanger the survival of the Iranian regime. In fact, the deal allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium and, over time, reach the brink of a nuclear breakout. The deal lifted crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for very weak limits on the regime's nuclear activity and no limits at all on its other malign behavior, including its sinister activities in Syria, Yemen, and other places all around the world. In other words, at the point when the United States had maximum leverage, this disastrous deal gave this regime, and it's a regime of great terror, many billions of dollars, some of it in actual cash. A great embarrassment to me as a citizen and to all citizens of the United States. A constructive deal could easily have been struck at the time, but it wasn't. At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Today, we have definitive proof that this Iranian promise was a lie. Last week, Israel published intelligence documents, long concealed by Iran, conclusively showing the Iranian regime and its history of pursuing nuclear weapons. The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will. In the years since the deal was reached, Iran's military budget has grown by almost 40%, while its economy is doing very badly. After the sanctions were lifted, the dictatorship used its new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, support terrorism, and cause havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond. The agreement was so poorly negotiated that even if Iran fully complies, the regime can still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout in just a short period of time. The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable. If I allowed this deal to stand, there would soon be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Everyone would want their weapons ready by the time Iran had theirs. Making matters worse, the deal's inspection provisions lack adequate mechanisms to prevent, detect, and punish cheating, and don't even have the unqualified right to inspect many important locations, including military facilities. Not only does the deal fail to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions, but it also fails to address the regime's development of ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads. Finally, the deal does nothing to constrain Iran's destabilizing activities, including its support for terrorism. Since the agreement, Iran's bloody ambitions have grown only more brazen. In light of these glaring flaws, I announced last October that the Iran deal must either be renegotiated or terminated. 3 months later, on January 12th, I repeated these conditions. I made clear that if the deal could not be fixed, the United States would no longer be a party to the agreement. Over the past few months, we have engaged extensively with our allies and partners around the world, including France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. We have also consulted with our friends from across the Middle East. We are unified in our understanding of the threat and in our conviction that Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. After these consultations, it is clear to me that we cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement. The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States. America will not be held hostage to nuclear blackmail. We will not allow American cities to be threatened with destruction, and we will not allow a regime that chants death to America to gain access to the most deadly weapons on earth. Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them. In fact, at this very moment, Secretary Pompeo is on his way to North Korea in preparation for my upcoming meeting with Kim Jong-un. Plans are being made, relationships are building. Hopefully a deal will happen, and with the help of China, South Korea, and Japan, a future of great prosperity and security can be achieved for everyone. As we exit the Iran deal, we will be working with our allies to find a real, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear threat. This will include efforts to eliminate the threat of Iran's ballistic missile program, to stop its terrorist activities worldwide, and to block its menacing activity across the Middle East. In the meantime, powerful sanctions will go into full effect. If the regime continues its nuclear aspirations, it will have bigger problems than it has ever had before. Finally, I want to deliver a message to the long-suffering people of Iran. The people of America stand with you. It has now been almost 40 years since this dictatorship seized power and took a proud nation hostage. Most of Iran's 80 million citizens have sadly never known an Iran that prospered in peace with its neighbors and commanded the admiration of the world. But the future of Iran belongs to its people. They are the rightful heirs to a rich culture and an ancient land, and they deserve a nation that does justice to their dreams, honor to their history, and glory to God. Iran's leaders will naturally say that they refuse to negotiate a new deal. They refuse, and that's fine. I'd probably say the same thing if I was in their position. But the fact is, they are going to want to make a new and lasting deal, one that benefits all of Iran and the Iranian people. When they do, I am ready, willing, and able. Great things can happen for Iran, and great things can happen for the peace and stability that we all want in the Middle East. There has been enough suffering, death, and destruction. Let it end now. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
President Trump from the diplomatic room of the White House, and with the stroke of a pen, will revoke the U.S. cooperation and as a signatory to the Iran deal. This is a hugely important moment in foreign policy. And I want to turn to Andrea Mitchell, who was listening along with me this afternoon. And Andrea, we heard the president lay out the critiques of this deal that was struck between Iran, 5 other countries, and the U.S. We heard what he thought was wrong with it. The question now is, what can they do that is better? What does Iran do now? Is Iran likely to go back to the negotiating table?
Thank you very much.
Just listening to see if the president is answering a question here, Savannah.
Right now,
let's listen.
going to North Korea. He will be there very shortly in a matter of virtual, probably an hour. He's got meetings set up. We have our meeting scheduled. We have our meetings set. The location is picked, the time and date, everything is picked, and we look forward to have a very great success. We think relationships are building with North Korea. We'll see how it all works out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But it can be a great thing for North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the entire world. We hope it all works out. Thank you very much.
The direct question that Kristen Welker, our correspondent, had asked was whether detainees were coming home.
We'll soon be finding out. We will soon be finding out. It would be a great thing if they are. We'll soon be finding out. Thank you very much.
Seems like the question's been posed a couple of times as the president walks out. Andrea, before we get into Iran, maybe we should just start right there because, of course,
indeed.
CIA Director, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo now on his way to North Korea, and the question is whether or not he will be retrieving detainees held there, American detainees.
And the president has announced what we have suspected now for the past 48 hours, that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is on his way to North Korea. It's in the middle of the night there, but he left here last night, we believe, and is not only negotiating the terms, the location of this upcoming summit, but one hopes, as the president just said, that he might be returning with 3 American detainees, 2 of whom were taken since President Trump took office, one prior to President Trump taking office. And these are 3 Americans we've long been trying to get back. It would be certainly a significant gesture of good faith from Kim Jong-un, who just returned himself from a secret, unreported trip up until the time he returned back home to China over the last couple of days. So a lot of secret diplomacy going on, and the president hoping for a big announcement out of North Korea with Mike Pompeo now on his way to North Korea, and one hopes coming back with 3 Americans at the very moment that the president is tearing up a nuclear deal that has been lauded around the world, and certainly by America's European allies.
Right, and all of these things are related in a sense. Let's go to our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who's in our London bureau, and we were just talking with Andrea before this information about the trip to North Korea and the potential retrieval of 3 American detainees from North Korea. Richard, the Iran deal, something you covered extensively. The U.S. is now out of it, and I think the question is, now what? What does Iran do? Will they go back to the negotiating table? What does this mean for its nuclear ambitions?
Well, I think the Iran deal now is not over, but it is certainly fatally flawed. And what we just saw with President Trump's statement is he's trying to present this as a swap. He's going to get rid of this old deal, which he never liked. He didn't sign, but that he never liked for clauses that he outlined. And he's going to replace it with a new deal with North Korea under him, and that deal is in process and that it's going to be a great deal. And he's opening the door for Iran to sort of join his bandwagon, or tear open their old contract and renegotiate. The problem was this Iran deal wasn't just with the United States. It was with large sections of the international community. European leaders have been coming to beat a trail to the White House to tell the president not to do what he just did, because not only does it undermine U.S. commitments, not only does it undermine international trust in the United States' ability to keep its word, but everybody's ability to keep their word, because everybody's name who was on that original Iran contract is now having to explain why the contract is being torn up, even though U.S. intelligence, the IAEA, all say that Iran is complying with the deal. So it hurts U.S. credibility. It hurts the credibility of the U.S. allies. It draws a wedge between the U.S. and its allies. It potentially causes an issue of sanctions with U.S. allies. The way the sanctions have generally worked is the U.S. puts sanctions on Iran, but it also puts sanctions on those who continue to do business with Iran. Because by doing business with Iran or certain Iranian entities, you can theoretically help Iran develop its military program and its nuclear program. So does that mean the U.S. is now going to be in a position where it is negotiating putting sanctions on its closest friends here in Europe? This is a very, very significant deal. It is not just this swap that he was presenting it. Well, we had this one deal, we're going to tear that one up, or we're going to get you a fantastic deal with North Korea. Stay tuned.
Yeah, there's that, and then as I turn to NBC's Tehran bureau chief Ali Arouzi, I mean, Ali, I think the question is also what Iran does, whether it looks at this as, well, okay, we can go right back to our enrichment activities. I mean, you hear some hardliners talking about, you know, getting the old reactors and the centrifuges spinning again. What's likely to happen there?
Well, Savannah, I think Iran is likely to react by saying that they never saw any benefits from the deal in the first place. And now that the United States has reneged on its end of the bargain completely and are in violation, well, therefore, they're going to restart their nuclear activities. Now, I don't think that means that Iran is going to start its nuclear activities at a blistering pace, kick out all of the inspectors, and announce that they're racing towards a nuclear weapon. What they're likely to do is restart their activities at an incremental pace, test the waters as they go along, maintaining their line that their nuclear program is for civilian purposes. They'll also try and create a wedge between Europe and America, which might work initially, but I can't see that being a sustainable long-term strategy, because ultimately Europe isn't going to divorce itself from America over Iran. But the big question here is, what is Iran's reaction going to be in the long term going forward as political and financial pressure mounts? And how much support can they rely on from Russia and China, their only real powerful allies? But, you know, Savannah, we're going to enter an era of unpredictable, a very unpredictable time, and where the consequences of any future miscalculation between Iran and America could have dire consequences. Look, it's important to point out that, you know, critics of the deal often ignore the fact that the deal was intended to keep Iran from producing a nuclear weapon, and that's exactly what it's been doing up until now anyway. And the fact of the matter is, it was working. Now all bets are off. Iran, if they wanted to, can restart their program without any checks and balances.
Ali Arouzi in Tehran for us, and I want to end with Hallie Jackson, because you cover this president every day. I mean, we're talking about not one but two big foreign policy bets here, with Iran and also with North Korea, both with nuclear ramifications.
And both, Savannah, uncharted territory for this president, significant foreign policy consequences. And as you rightly noted, both of them tied together in a way. You heard the president alluding to that message, I think, in his remarks when he said, hey, I don't do bad deals, I only do good deals. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, let this be a message that I keep my word. That seemed to be aimed directly at Pyongyang, directly toward where his Secretary of State will be landing, he said, in a matter of just an hour now. And Savannah, as I share with you, the French president now saying France, Germany, and the UK regret the U.S. decision to leave the nuclear deal. We are now starting to get reaction from our allies. That will continue through the afternoon and in the weeks ahead.
Lots to cover, lots to follow here. Hallie, we know you're right there. Thanks to all of our correspondents. We've got full details tonight on NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. For now, I'm Savannah Guthrie, NBC
Do they want? The deal as it currently existed was fatally flawed for what was in it. It was fatally flawed for what wasn't in it. Iran was continuing all sorts of bad, illegal, nefarious activities, overthrowing foreign governments, financing terror. We're seeing that they have blood on their hands. They unjustly imprison United States Navy sailors. They still hold American hostages there in their country today. If Iran wants to continue this Iran nuclear deal, we have to deal with the sunset provision, we have to strengthen the verification regime, and they have to knock it off with all of these other bad, nefarious, illegal activities. There's no way that the status quo is going to work. It's destabilizing the Middle East, it's destabilizing the world, and on their holidays when they're chanting death to America, they're calling Israel the little Satan and America the great Satan. You know, and I heard a previous guest earlier in the program talking about Rouhani being a moderate. When you look at Iran's activities and with the IRGC and propping up Assad in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon, Rouhani is no moderate. And he's been appeasing the hardliners with some really bad behavior that's been taking lives, disabling that region and the world. I believe the onus, most importantly, really needs to be in Iran. If they want to save this deal going forward, if they want to keep it together, then they are going to have to be willing to make some concessions.
Did the president give them an opening to do that? Do you think that what the president just announced right there gave Iran an opening to renegotiate this deal, or did it set Iran on a path to going back to where they were before the deal was implemented in the first place?
I think the terms have been laid out clearly when one decision after another over the course of the last several months through today. Iran knows what it needs to do. And we have also been clear to our European allies what Iran needs to do. And the Europeans, they're not happy with Iran's behavior. I mean, this is a problem, especially when you get closer to
French
Iran.
President Emmanuel Macron has just tweeted, France, Germany, and the UK regret the U.S. decision to leave the JCPOA. I mean, they're saying the nuclear non-proliferation regime is at stake. They are not happy with the United States violating this deal. They might not be happy with Iran, but they were advocating to stay in it.
Yeah, well, a few thoughts come to mind. For one is what those countries really want is the benefit of being able to do business with both the United States and Iran. Economically, they have benefited greatly from this deal. They want to continue to benefit greatly from this deal. So that's one important point, that when you have a big company
so you're saying France,
in
Germany, and the UK are all benefiting economically, and so they're fine in your mind, Iran violating it and putting itself on a path to develop nuclear weapons. The president talked about a lot of things in that speech a moment ago, but he also said that the JCPOA allows Iran to produce nuclear weapons, basically urges them to produce nuclear weapons. That's not what the JCPOA did. I mean, that's misrepresenting the deal entirely.
Well, first off, to that last point, when I mentioned the economic piece, which is a reality, I also said that a few different points come to mind. But that was one. As it relates to the terms of the JCPOA, there is, for us here in the United States, when we think of 10 years from now, that feels like a lifetime away. For Iran, the way they view these things, 10 years from now, in the lifetime of a nation is nothing. So they're able to, the regime that was struggling to stay in power was able to stay in power. They get all of the sanctions relief and all of that money. They're able to obtain a nuclear weapon at the end of this deal. And when they look at 10 years down the road, that's nothing for them. Now, as far as the terms of the JCPOA itself, now what's important to note is that in the deal, they are allowed to work on certain aspects of their nuclear program. They are allowed to have IR-6 rotor assemblies. They are allowed to have IR-8 rotor assemblies. Now, the problem is they have actually gone over that number. You could debate whether or not you think that that's a substantial violation or a technical violation. We shouldn't get into that. And the IAEA has focused in on the heavy water violations a couple of times.
Yeah, it's not just the IAEA that said, though, that Iran was complying. It's Defense Secretary Mattis. It's DNI Coates. It's now Secretary of State Pompeo. It's the Israeli generals talking to Netanyahu. So the idea that Iran was in violation of the deal is a bit overstating it when many folks have said that no, in fact, they're pretty much complying with it in all of the major ways. Congressman, hold on one second. I do want to bring in NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, also NBC News Tehran Bureau Chief and Correspondent Ali Arouzi. Andrea, you were there for the negotiations. I watched you reporting on it day in and day out. Bring us back to that moment when the U.S. was dealing with Iran in order to get this done, and why at the time it felt like such an important negotiation, why it needed to happen then.
Well, Iran was basically only months away from having a nuclear weapon. And the fact is that the Allies decided, 6 countries plus the European Union, the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, and the European Union decided that it was worth it to get a deal that would have them as signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, have permanent eyes on UN inspectors, more than 400 inspections so far since the Iran deal was signed, and be able to go to places that they had not been previously able to go to, and a permanent break in the fuel line where they can not get nuclear fuel for all of these years, that was worth not negotiating on missiles and not negotiating on Iran's support for terrorism in the region. So they deliberately blocked off the areas that the president is most concerned about. They also have a time limit on it where there's a permanent agreement not to develop a weapon, but in fact, they will be able to get some reprocessing for non-nuclear weapons grade uranium, as well as some centrifuges back by 2025 and 2030. That was the deal. And the idea was that they would block a nuclear program, at least for those many years, and that the breakout would be at least 1 year if Iran were to cheat, because they would have these multiple inspections.
So, Andrea,
that was what the world has argued is worth it.
What's the timeline now? If the breakout was a year while we were in the deal,
right.
What does it look like now? Are we now counting down to that year mark?
Well, it would depend now exactly what the regime does. The problem is that by reneging on the deal, the U.S. and the president said today it's going to be the strictest form of sanctions, which means that any European company that wants to deal in banks and in dollars, which is the world's denomination, cannot do any business with Iran. And Iran said that they were agreeing to this deal because they were going to be welcomed back into the world economy. It will affect oil prices because they are the third largest oil producer, and prices will go up. Americans will feel this at the pump. So no matter what the U.S. does now, they have basically said to the rest of the world, we are not obeying an agreement that we signed, and that the United States of America under one administration can sign deals, but it will not be trusted by subsequent presidents.
Ali, you're in Tehran. President Rouhani has reacted. Will the Iranians stay in the deal? Have they announced?
Well, Katie, I mean, earlier today, President Rouhani said that if the deal is workable with the Europeans, if the Iranians see the benefits from the deal, if the Europeans hold up their end of the bargain, then they don't need America, that they'll stay in the accord. But other very powerful voices in Iran haven't echoed that sentiment. They said that if America isn't in the deal, they're going to pull out. They've said that Iran won't be passive if Trump rips up the deal. They've said that the only voice America understands is the voice of force, and the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, really threw down the gauntlet a few hours ago, saying that they're not scared of American sanctions, they're not scared of an American military attack, and they're ready for any possible scenario here. So the big question here is, what is Iran's reaction going to be going forward? There is going to be unsurmountable political and financial pressure on Iran, and as that carries on, we have to see how Iran reacts, what sort of support they can rely on from Russia and China. But we are going to enter an era of unpredictability where the consequences of any future miscalculation between Iran and America is going to have some very serious consequences. Look, it's important to point out that, from the 1979 revolution till the point of the nuclear deal in 2013, Iran and America didn't speak to each other at all. Then there was some détente. There was a working relationship between Kerry and Zarif. Now, the Trump administration didn't build on that at all. Instead, they decided, look, we're not going to talk to these guys whatsoever. That makes things a very dangerous situation. And Iran doesn't react very well to that kind of pressure. And as I mentioned earlier, this is going to weaken Rouhani. Rouhani came in with a more moderate stance. Listen, look, we can talk to America. He had a phone call with Obama after the deal was made. He is going to lose all credibility in this country. The hardliners are going to have the main voice in this country. They're going to be calling the shots going forward, and that's not going to be good with any sort of relationship with America. The animosity is going to be palpable going forward.
I know, Congressman.
I don't see Iran coming back to the negotiating
I know
table.
Congressman Lee Zeldin scoffed at the idea of Rouhani as a moderate, but I think the point you're making is moderate is relative, moderate within Iran, not obviously a moderate within the United States. Andrea, I do want to get your take on Pompeo going to North Korea in just a second, but I do want to go to Nick Kristof one more time. Nick, if they do stay in the deal, if Iran stays in and just ends up working with the EU and other European countries, where does that put the U.S.?
So I think that Europe will indeed try to stay in the deal, and I think that will delay an imminent sense of crisis. I think the pessimists are too bleak for the short term. But frankly, I don't think it's going to work terribly well to try to have Europe and Iran continue without us. I think the secondary sanctions are indeed going to scare off European companies. I think it's going to be difficult to work around that. And so I think over time, I would be skeptical if that will work. And that's why I think, indeed, that we're not imminently headed for hostilities, but over time, we may be. I also just want to respond to something Congressman Zeldin said, because I think he was taking a swipe at me for maybe being naive about Iran. And I would just say that, I reported in Iran, and I've been detained in Iran and accused of being a spy. And I certainly understand the repression there. But I don't think that simply asking Iran to back off, give up your nukes, that's not a strategy, that's hope. And it's precisely because Iran is untrustworthy that we need to employ inspectors, that we need to employ this kind of international agreement to try to reduce the risk. And in contrast, I think President Trump and I think Congressman Zeldin are resorting simply to kind of a delusion as the basis for their policy.
Congressman?
Yeah, I would love to respond. I mean, the fact is, what we do know about the verification regime, the side deals between the IAEA and Iran, is Iran collects some of its own soil samples. They're inspecting some of their own nuclear sites. Now, we haven't seen all the details of the verification regime. This deal, as President Obama said, is not built on trust. It's built on verification. We haven't even seen what the verification is. And there's no one who's come on your show who is able to say, I read the verification regime. So that's a pretty important point for us to note of what we actually do know about it, where they're collecting their own soil samples, inspecting some of their own sites. The other thing I want to point out is this. We're all concerned. I mean, every one of your guests, I'm sure they all sound concerned about Iran's other bad, nefarious, illegal terrorist activities. And yes, there was a decision made not to include that in part of the negotiations for the JCPOA. That was a problem because we negotiated away the leverage that brought the Iranians to the table. So right now, we don't have the leverage to deal with all of Iran's other bad activities. We don't want to have a military conflict with Iran. We want to use our soft power to achieve the results that we're looking for with Iran and in that region. It was a problem that at that table, when we had Iran at the table, that we said it's okay not to deal with any of those other bad activities, which have actually only significantly increased since the JCPOA was entered into.
Are you concerned about America's word? I mean, what country can trust America if from administration to administration deals will not be upheld?
Well, I don't feel that way at all. First off, as it relates to the Iran nuclear deal, and we were just discussing this a little bit earlier, but the IAEA has twice found Iran in violation of the heavy water protocol.
Yeah, but those were very minuscule. Those were very minuscule. And,
I'll give you a bigger one.
And nobody is saying that they were in real violation of the deal.
Well, here's another example.
Lee, that is blowing things a bit out of proportion, according to what the assessments are from the experts that have spoken to us about it.
Well, let me give you another example. So the JCPOA says that we are allowed to inspect the IAEA is allowed to inspect their military sites. Iran said before, during, and after the negotiation in crystal clear terms that the IAEA will absolutely not be inspecting their military sites. So when we went to Parchin before the JCPOA went into effect, and we found multiple man-made particles of uranium that we needed to follow up on, the response from Iran wasn't, hey, you can come back to Parchin and follow up on those two different particles you found. The response was, you're not coming back to Parchin. So specifically as it relates to the military aspect of it, and we've been talking a lot about the sunset piece, the verification regime has to get strengthened, and that's something that's in the JCPOA, and Iran is saying, there's no way that we're going to let you look at our military sites. That too is a problem.
Congressman Lee Zeldin. Congressman, thank you. Andrea, I know you have news from Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, on the plane. And what do you have?
This pool report from the plane, this is from the pool reporter, it's Carol Morello from the Washington Post representing all the rest of us. Pompeo says he doesn't know whom he's going to meet, His first trip was an intelligence gathering trip to see if what the South Koreans said Kim Jong-un was willing to agree to was real. Now he says he wants specifics. This trip is different. He wants the agenda for the summit. He hopes that they get the 3 Americans. He says that would be a great gesture. He did talk off camera to the reporters in the back of the plane, an Associated Press representative and a representative from the Washington Post on this secret mission. They left around 9:30 last night from Andrews Air Force Base, refueled in Alaska. They expect to arrive shortly in North Korea. The other piece of it is that they want to make sure that their expectations are met and that they're not going to lift sanctions until they get a real deal, achieve their objectives. Clearly, they're trying to contrast this with the Iran deal, which they, of course, as you have been reporting, which the president says was so fatally flawed.
Again, important to note, the president never said that Iran was in violation of the deal, but by withdrawing, he has now put the United States in violation of the deal. Andrea Mitchell, thank you very much. Nicholas Kristof, Brian McCann, Trita Parsi, and Congressman Lee Zeldin. We appreciate it, and we will be right back.
There was an idea to bring together a group of remarkable people to help save the universe from paying too much on their car insurance.
Hey, there's cake in the break room. What are you doing?
Nothing.
Marvel Studios' Avengers Infinity War, in theaters April 27th.
Now, where were we?
Hey, Janet. Hey, Kim. Can you suggest any good housekeeping?